What if it's a directive that isn't a crime, but would violate the civil rights of an individual? Are you obligated to follow that directive?
Objection of one.
Can you clarify that question for me?
Yes, sir. If Lieutenant Garcia tells you to do something in the course and scope of your duties that is not a crime, but would violate the civil rights of an individual, are you obligated to comply with that directive?
Objection of one.
Yes.
Okay. Once the individuals were all detained, including Mr. Weiss, did you have a chance to look around at the general environment where these people were being detained?
Yes.
Did you observe tackle boxes on the pier belonging to these individuals?
I observed tackle boxes on the pier.
Did you observe fishing rods belonging to these individuals?
I observed fishing rods.
Did those fishing rods have, and I understand you may not, I'm assuming that once you had them handcuffed, none of them cast a line into the water after they were handcuffed. Would that be a fair assumption?
Yes.
After the scene had calmed down, did you have an opportunity to observe that there were in fact fishing lines from these fishing rods belonging to these individuals in the water?
I did observe fishing rods set up on the pier with lines in the water.
And when you approached these individuals, they were standing within a few feet of their fishing rods when you initially approached, correct?
When I approached, my line of sight only allowed me to see Mr. Taylor. So I could not see what the other individuals were or weren't doing.
And that was a dynamic and stressful situation at that time, right?
It was my line of sight. They were sacked behind Officer Taylor, and the other officers that were spread to the left had their line of sight on them.
But in reviewing the video, you're able to clearly see these individuals did in fact have fishing rods nearby when you detained them.
Rephrase the question, please.
As you reviewed your video yesterday, can you confirm today that on June 24th, 2018, when you approached 5 individuals on the South Point Pier, all of the armed individuals had fishing rods near them when you and your fellow officers approached?
Yes.
At any point, Officer Rivera, did you raise any concerns or objections about the continued detention of these individuals during the time they were handcuffed?
No.
Did you hear any fellow officers raise any concerns or questions regarding why they were continuing to be held in handcuffs?
No.
Would you agree that within minutes of arriving on the pier, you had all the firearms taken away from these individuals?
Yes.
Would you agree that within minutes of arriving on the pier, you and your fellow officers had all of the firearms unloaded?
Yes.
So you and your fellow officers were the only ones with loaded firearms by this point?
Yes.
Now, I understand y'all may have received some information that additional individuals were coming even after Mr. Weiss. Is that right?
Yes.
What was the source of that information, sir?
I believe, I'm not sure which individual was stated something about that group was was either a forum or a group that was doing a demonstration. and that other individuals that were part of the either forum or group were, I'm not sure if the correct word is RSVP'd, but we're planning to come out for a planned demonstration or protest or something to that manner.
But, okay, once you received that information, did you understand that these were in fact not sovereign citizens or part of a sovereign citizens group?
Objection of form.
Not necessarily.
At some point, were the handcuffs removed from the individuals?
Yes.
Once the handcuffs were removed, were the individuals immediately released, or did the detention continue for some additional period of time?
Objection of form.
I don't recall specifically if it was immediate. I don't recall the amount of time it took after from handcuffing to.
Did you overhear, oh, excuse me, did you observe Lieutenant Garcia being on his cell phone during the time period of the incident on a phone call?
Yes.
Do you have any idea who he talked to?
I do not.
Were you able to overhear his side of any of his conversations on that phone call?
No.
At some point, did Lieutenant Garcia issue a general instruction to you and the fishermen regarding what would happen with their firearms upon their release?
Yes.
And that direction was that these individuals would not be given back their firearms except by you or fellow officers placing the firearms in these vehicles, in these persons' vehicles, right?
Yes.
And y'all were directed to place them in their vehicles unloaded.
I'm sorry.
You and your fellow officers were directed to place the firearms in the fishermen's vehicles unloaded.
Yes. Yes.
Officer Garcia, do we need to take a quick break for you?
Yes.
No problem. Can we take about a 10-minute break?
Thank you.
No problem.
So, Officer Garcia, just before the break, we were talking about how the firearms were returned on June 24th, 2018. So, were you personally responsible for returning any of the firearms?
You used the wrong name.
Officer, I apologize. Officer Rivera, before we took a break, we were talking about the return of the firearms to the fishermen. Were you personally responsible for returning any of the firearms?
Yes.
And do you remember which individuals you returned firearms to personally?
Yes.
Which individuals?
Mr. Taylor.
Anybody else?
Not that I recall, no.
And did you inform Mr. Taylor that the only way he would be getting his firearm back was if he opened his vehicle for you to place the firearm in his vehicle?
I believe that was a directive from Lieutenant Garcia.
And you carried out that directive?
Yes.
Or do you believe you're obligated to carry out every directive you're given from Lieutenant Garcia, regardless of the propriety of the directive?
Objection of form.
You can answer the question.
Yes.
So no matter what directive he gives, you're obligated to follow that directive.
Objection of form.
No.
If Lieutenant are you obligated to follow any directive Lieutenant Garcia gives you in the course and scope of your duties?
Objection of form.
As long as it is obviously, if Lieutenant Garcia gives me a directive to commit a crime, no. But if it's a justifiable, if it's a reasonable command or directive, yes.
Okay. What if it's a directive that isn't a crime, but would violate the civil rights of an individual? Are you obligated to follow that directive?
Objection affirmed.
Can you clarify that question for me?
Yes, sir. If Lieutenant Garcia tells you to do something in the course and scope of your duties that is not a crime, but would violate the civil rights of an individual, are you obligated to comply with that directive?
Objection affirmed.
Yes.
Okay. Are you familiar with the plain view doctrine, Officer Rivera?
Yes.
Anything you see in your plain view, you're allowed to, if it creates reasonable articulable suspicion or probable cause, you're allowed to pursue that plain view, aren't you?
Yes.
And in fact, things you see in plain view when you are lawfully inside or opening the door of a vehicle, you're allowed to pursue that if you see any evidence of a crime in that instance, aren't you?
Yes.
You're trained to try and obtain a better view of a vehicle to see if there's anything that gives you evidence of a crime, aren't you?
Yes.
And by opening, do you remember if you placed this firearm in Mr. Taylor's trunk?
Yes.
It was in the trunk?
Yes.
Could you see in the trunk prior to Mr. Taylor opening the trunk?
No.
But by requiring him to open his trunk to obtain the return of his firearm, you were able to see in the trunk, weren't you?
Yes.
You didn't observe any evidence of criminal activity in his trunk, did you?
No.
Had you observed such evidence of criminal activity in his trunk, it would have allowed you to continue the detention, wouldn't it?
Objection affirmed.
Yes.
Did Mr. Taylor object to the manner or method in which he returned his firearm?
Yes.
Did you have any legal right, in your opinion, to continue to detain his firearm once you determined that he was lawfully permitted to possess that firearm?
Objection affirmed.
Join.
You can answer the question.
Yes.
What legal basis did you have to continue to keep his firearm?
Again, I was under the directive of my lieutenant, and for our safety, that's the procedures that we use.
Okay, we'll come back to procedures that you use in a moment. But I'm asking, under the laws of the state of Florida, were you aware of anything that gave you the legal right to continue to detain Mr. Taylor's property, whether firearm or other property, once you determined no crime had been committed?
Specific Florida statute? No.
Form.
Did you discover the commission of any criminal activity on June 24th, 2018 by any of the fishermen?
I did not.
So at the time you returned the firearm, you had no more suspicion or belief that Mr. Taylor had committed or was in the commission of any criminal activity?
Objection affirmed.
Object to the form of the question asked and answered.
You can answer, officer.
No.
But you dictated, based on Lieutenant Garcia's orders, how that firearm would be returned to Mr. Taylor.
Yes.
Did you unload all of his magazines for his firearm?
Yes.
Did you place when I say rounds, you understand that means bullets and casing the ammunition for the firearm, right?
Yes.
Did you place all of his rounds in a rubber glove that you use when handling evidence?
Yes.
So in order to make his firearm functional, again, for the purposes of self-defense, Mr. Taylor was required to open that glove, right?
Yes.
He was then required to reload ammunition into the magazine, correct?
Yes.
He was then required to put the magazine in the firearm. Yes?
Yep.
And he was then required to chamber a round in the firearm so that it would be available to him if he needed it for self-defense.
Yes.
And to do any of this, he would have to reopen his trunk and get all of this property out of the trunk in order to do all of those actions, right?
Yes.
So from the time you placed that firearm in his trunk until he took all of those actions, Mr. Taylor did not have a operable firearm ready for the defense of himself or others, did he?
Objection to form.
Yes.
Yes, that was a correct statement.
Yes.
No, he did not have a functioning firearm he could use for self-defense until he took all those steps.
Correct.